Today I rise on behalf of the nearly 80 million Americans across the country who get their health insurance through Medicaid. I rise as a physician who has cared for patients for more than 20 years, and I implore my colleagues to recognize that health insurance is not just a throwaway line item that you can scratch out in a budget. It is the difference between being able to receive the life-saving health care you need or not. Medicaid is the single largest source of health care coverage in the United States. Medicaid covers nearly half of all children, and it is the largest insurer of kids with disabilities. Medicaid is a vital source of prenatal and postpartum care for women, and it covers more than 40% of births in our country. The Republicans' dangerous proposal today is selling out the health and wellness of kids, families, seniors in nursing homes, and people with disabilities. And why? To make room for tax breaks for millionaires? This is wrong. We cannot stand for this. To my colleagues across the aisle, we need you to stand up for our children and families. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I notice there's not a lot of people on the other side wanting to defend this budget. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Republican budget can be summed up in 3 simple words: defund, defraud, and deceive. First, the Republicans want to defund social safety net programs working families rely on, like Medicaid and school meals and food stamps. In my district alone, 425,000 individuals depend on Medicaid for their health care. That includes kids and people with disabilities. Second, Republicans want to defraud the American people by taking money from working families to hand out massive tax breaks to billionaires and corporations who pay little to no taxes. And finally, they are trying to deceive the American people by claiming that they're not cutting any programs. But we know at the end of the day that their budget will include cuts to Medicaid and programs that families depend on. Republicans need to step up, because this is not just a blue state or a Democratic issue. This will cut benefits, healthcare benefits, for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans across the country, including 171,000 in Arizona's 6th district.
The gentleman's time has expired.
So we need Republicans to step up.
The gentleman's time
and not
has expired.
be shameful and pass this budget. With that,
The gentleman's
I yield
time has
back.
expired.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I don't know if the gentleman wants to give us some of her time, because we get a lot of speakers over here. I guess not. Okay.
Wait, you're not up.
Hawaii. Okay. Hawaii. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Takuda.
Thank you. I rise today in strong opposition to the House Republican budget resolution, a blatant attempt to strip health care and food aid away from everyday Americans. With up to $2.5 trillion in Medicaid cuts and $230 billion slashed from SNAP, this budget plan would leave millions of families and seniors without essential support, and rural America would suffer the most. Nationwide, more than 12 million rural Americans rely on Medicaid, and SNAP participation is higher in rural areas than urban ones. In my home state of Hawaii, over 350,000 people rely on Medicaid, and nearly 1 in 5 depend on SNAP to eat. Rural Americans who live in 181 of our congressional districts, red and blue, already face some of the harshest health disparities, living 3 to 10 years less than their urban counterparts. These cuts will only deepen such inequities and leave them with no safety net. Let me be clear, these cuts will cost lives. These are not just numbers, they are real people. They are our neighbors, our grandparents, and our children. At a time when too many are struggling, Republicans are delivering tax breaks to billionaires on the backs of our working families. Americans in rural America deserve better. Our country deserves better. I urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me just say, by the way, Mr. Speaker, how's that mandate going for you guys now that voters are realizing that you betrayed them? Let's look at some of your newspapers from around the country. Georgia congressman confronted by angry crowd over support for Trump's agenda. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Quote, U.S. Rep. Rich McCormick was peppered with boos and catcalls throughout a town hall meeting in Roswell late Thursday as hundreds of critics jeered the Republican for backing President Donald Trump's agenda during his first month in office. There's another one. Quote, U.S. Rep. Glenn Grothman faces hostile crowd in Oshkosh town hall meeting. That's in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Quote, protesters urge Rep. Scott Perry to say no to Medicaid cuts. That's in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Quote, outside Congressman's office, protesters make noise over potential Medicaid cuts. That's from Representative Ryan McKenzie's district in Salisbury Township in Pennsylvania. I could spend an hour reading into the record, Mr. Speaker. Republicans are getting chewed out at all of their town halls. Something is happening in this country right now, and you can feel it, because people are waking up to the betrayal, and they are angry, and they have a right to be angry. So for my Republican colleagues, just remember that when you vote for this budget, you are on record. You have made it clear that you serve the billionaires and not your voters. And at this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Looking around this room, I ask my colleagues, shouldn't our government benefit those we represent back home? But what's being presented by my Republican colleagues today? A plan that would gut 152,483 of my neighbors at home who depend on Medicaid for health care. More than 66,000 kids under the age of 19. 10,000 seniors back home rely on Medicaid in Illinois 17 for their nursing home coverage. While you may see this as a numbers game on a budget, I see families, I see neighbors, I see loved ones, and let me let you in on a secret, because there aren't any Republicans in this room. There are more Republican constituents of mine that are calling my office saying, we may have voted for Donald Trump, but we didn't vote for him to do this. This is cruel and unusual punishment to single out everyday Americans, making them go without. Also, billionaire donors and big corporations get the tax breaks to make them more wealthy. Let's get back to doing the work for the American people who need us to do this work the most. I yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana, recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Can I inquire how much time we have remaining?
12 and 3/4 minutes remaining. And the gentleman from Indiana has 12 minutes.
I know the gentlelady doesn't seem to have any other speakers. I was wondering whether she might want to lend us some of her time. Okay, all right, thank you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, the Speaker Emerita, a powerful leader in the Democratic caucus, and for the country, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his exuberant presentation of opposition to this budget. Thank you for all the amendments you proposed to improve upon it. Sadly, the Republicans didn't accept just one. Here you go again. The last time the Republicans had a majority in the House and Senate and President Trump in the White House, they passed a terrible bill that was a tax cut for the rich that gave 83% of the benefits to the wealthiest people, the top 1% in our country, and added $2 trillion to the national debt. This year, they're doubling down on that, $4 trillion to the national debt, and they call that fiscal sanity. And they're doing it by steering taxpayer dollars from Medicaid to give additional tax breaks to billionaires and big corporations. People think of Medicaid sometimes as a poor children's program, and that would be sufficient justification for it at all. But it is a middle-income benefit. People with seniors who need long-term health care need Medicaid. Just listen to your constituents. Hear what they have to say about what it means to their fiscal well-being. Listen to your constituents. The numbers are staggering. By voting for this cruel bill, you are betraying hardworking Americans by raising costs for all those already struggling to make ends meet. The president said he was going to reduce the cost of living. He didn't. Reduce inflation. He didn't. Indeed, a vote for this budget is a vote against Medicaid, ripping away health care from children, people with disabilities, and seniors. And it is a vote against SNAP, as the distinguished chairman indicated, taking food out of the mouths of babies. And you do that with glee. While President Trump and congressional Republicans are choosing to protect billionaires, by the way, who benefit from Medicaid, with people cleaning their homes and staffing.
Generally, an additional 30 seconds.
We are led and unified by Hakeem Jeffries, are united in our commitment to work for working families. That is why I urge a no vote on this extreme measure. Thank the distinguished chairman for his leadership and yield back my time.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from the Economic Policy Institute entitled, "The House Republicans Plan to Cut Medicaid to Pay for Tax Cuts for the Rich, would slash incomes for the bottom 40%. And Mr.
Without
Speaker,
objection.
this article details how these cuts would hurt working families more than any tax relief that they might receive. At this point, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansbury.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I rise today to oppose this so-called budget resolution, which is one of the greatest heists in American history, as they loot the Treasury to give permanent tax breaks to billionaires at the expense of millions of Americans. We're talking about cuts to health care, Medicaid, Medicare, literally 250,000 New Mexicans who will be unable to access care, cuts to income and food assistance, billions of dollars that goes to families to keep food on the table and a roof over their head, and to give tax breaks to billionaires. They're going to cut vital programs that go to our lowest income and most vulnerable families. And as a native New Mexican who grew up in a single parent home in a low income family, I know exactly what this means. These cuts are cruel, they are unnecessary, they are undemocratic, and they will blow a hole through our deficit spending by $4 trillion. Because this is not a budget resolution, this is a blueprint for suffering, or, as Elon Musk put it over the weekend, the spoils of war. Because these guys don't care how many people they hurt or how many families are going to suffer. It's about power and greed, and the GOP is enabling them. So we will not sit down and do it. We will not support this budget resolution, and we will not give them
Women's time has expired.
Vote. And I will not be silenced
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Continue to fight.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter to Speaker Johnson signed by 8 Republicans entitled, "Protecting American Communities in the Budget Reconciliation Process." And
without objection.
this letter makes clear that they know that Medicaid, Pell Grants, and SNAP will face harmful cuts if this budget passes. Madam Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to provide for consideration of an amendment to the budget resolution which prevents tax cuts for billionaires if Medicaid is cut by a single cent. Madam Speaker, 72 million Americans, including 30 million children, rely on Medicaid for critical health care and other life-saving services. But with this budget resolution, House Republicans are betraying the most vulnerable Americans to give tax breaks to billionaires. Representative Gray submitted an amendment that would prevent Republicans from betraying Medicaid recipients in order to give billionaires tax breaks. It shouldn't be controversial. I offered that amendment last night in the Rules Committee, and to my shock, every single one of my Republican colleagues voted against it. Every single one of them, standing with billionaires over Medicaid recipients. Now I'm giving every House Republican a chance to go on the record. Voting yes on the previous question means you want to cut taxes for billionaires, even at the expense of vital Medicaid coverage. Voting no gives you an opportunity to ensure that Medicaid is protected. It is that simple. So, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment into the record along with any extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. And to discuss our proposal, I yield 3 minutes.
Without objection.
To the sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from California, Mr. Gray.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today conflicted about what is happening in our government and across the country. Like many Americans, I find myself frustrated with government that doesn't work, lines that are too long, services that are too hard to navigate, roads that don't get fixed. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. All of us here today should be in favor of making our government work better, of strengthening programs that our constituents rely upon. In fact, some of my Republican colleagues, led by Congressman Tony Gonzalez, write in a letter to Speaker Johnson that the proposed cuts to Medicaid within this budget would have serious consequences, particularly in rural and Hispanic communities where hospitals and nursing homes are already struggling to keep their doors open. One of those communities where hospitals are struggling to stay open is mine in California's Central Valley. Over 450,000 people in my congressional district rely on Medicaid for their health coverage. The Central Valley is also experiencing health care shortage, forcing people to drive across the country, across county lines, across the state, waiting for hours to see a provider. These proposed cuts to Medicaid only stand to worsen the crisis. Let's be clear, these cuts wouldn't just impact individuals covered by Medicaid. In my congressional district, 59% of individuals are covered by California's Medicaid program. That means that doctors and hospitals in my district rely on Medicaid for nearly 2/3 of their revenue. Without that revenue, these providers would not be able to keep their doors open. In fact, Madam Speaker, there is an entire county I represent with a population of 162,000 people who have no hospital at all to go to because it had to close. I submitted an amendment to this resolution to ask a simple question. Is it such a priority to fund tax cuts for individuals with over $1 billion in net worth that we would enact devastating cuts to health care for rural and low-income communities? This proposal would steal from the poor to give to the rich. But even if you don't think that's a problem, Madam Speaker, this literally makes health care coverage worse for every single person living in rural America. I've spent the majority of my career in public service working to make health care better, both more accessible and more affordable. This proposed budget does the opposite. My amendment to the proposed budget would prevent consideration of any legislation that would result in cuts to Medicaid in order to provide such tax cuts. Unfortunately, that amendment was blocked from consideration by members of the Rules Committee last night. To my Republican colleagues who agree that we must protect Medicaid, I hope you'll join me in support of this amendment should I have the opportunity to offer it here. This is my common sense solution to honor the trust our constituents put in us when they sent us to Congress. I urge my colleagues to oppose the PQ and support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the ranking member has discussed a number of votes taken at the Rules Committee markup last night. Once again, the budget is the first step in the process, not the last. Many of these amendments will have the opportunity to be debated thoughtfully and ad nauseum, I have no doubt, in the authorizing committees. The Democrats are speaking fear, not facts. Saying something that is false over and over again does not make it true. These amendments can be given consideration in the committees of jurisdiction. That is the process of regular order. And I reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I just want to say to the gentlelady, I mean, Republican members are raising concerns about these cuts, and maybe we can share some of those press clippings with her. At this point, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. This budget is about the millionaires, the trillionaires, the people earning over $400,000 a year, and giving them a $4 trillion tax cut over the next 10 years. It's not about working people. It's about hurting working people, hurting the poor, hurting people with disabilities, and hurting children. What this Congress is looking at doing, because of Musk and Trump and the Republican colleagues here that I share this floor with, is cutting and cutting and cutting programs that help the public. In October, Elon Musk incorporated in Texas United States of America, Inc. What that means is shows his mentality. He thinks he owns this government. He's bought it. He's been given it. And he doesn't care about anybody else. He is the only stockholder. America, you are not a stockholder. You are the people that give him the money to give it to the trillionaires and billionaires who were first in President Trump's inaugural crowd. They were first in the crowd. They're first in his mind. They're first in his heart. They're his people. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I will reiterate, saying something false over and over again doesn't make it true. I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah. Madam Speaker, I just say to the gentlelady that facts do matter, and her members are complaining about the cuts in the Republican budget. Read them. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Dexter.
The gentlelady from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in opposition to this rule, which allows for consideration of Republicans' extreme budget that slashes funding for vital programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and federal housing assistance to bankroll $4.5 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and big corporations. Last week, I got a devastating call from Susan, who lives in Sandy, Oregon. She and her husband worked all their lives and saved diligently for retirement, but had a single accident that wiped out their savings. They are now in their 70s and rely on Medicaid, SNAP, and utility assistance to just barely make ends meet each month. The legislation in front of us today would rip these benefits from Susan and her husband, denying them access to health care, forcing them to ration their food, and jeopardizing their ability to remain in their home. And for what? To line the pockets of the ultra-wealthy, to pad the bottom line of corporations already raking in profits. I offered 6 common sense amendments to this bill to safeguard critical programs for people like Susan and so many Oregonians like her. Republicans rejected every single one of those amendments. Because all has been true all along, they have no interest in protecting America's middle class.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized. Gentleman reserves, I'm sorry.
I reserve.
Gentleman
may I
from
inquire,
Massachusetts is recognized.
May I inquire of the gentlelady how many more speakers she has? Whether, I mean, sister, I can't remember the last time she had one, but...
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentlelady is prepared to close.
May I inquire,
the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
May I inquire my time?
Gentleman has 2 1/4 minutes remaining.
Okay. I yield myself to remaining time.
You are recognized.
Madam Speaker, a majority of Americans now say that Donald Trump is doing a bad job in handling the economy, and I don't blame them. Prices are going up on everything, in large part because of Trump's tariffs. Meanwhile, wages for workers have not kept pace with inflation for decades. Home ownership is slipping out of the reach for more and more people. And so I will end this debate where we began. Whose side are my Republican colleagues on? Talk is cheap, Madam Speaker. This place runs on hot air from corrupt politicians whose only care in the world is where their next campaign check comes from. Last night in the Rules Committee, Democrats gave Republicans a chance to show whose side they're on. Every single one of them voted against protecting Medicaid so they could give tax breaks to billionaires. That's how they voted. Every single one of them voted against protecting the child tax credit so they could give tax cuts to billionaires. Every single one of them voted against protecting food assistance for hungry families so they could give tax breaks to billionaires. And so the gentlelady can claim whatever she wants. The truth is this budget betrays the middle class in favor of tax giveaways for billionaires. It gives trillions in handouts to the ultra-wealthy, billionaires and greedy corporations to the tune of $314,266 each every year for the top 0.1%. And that's an average. Some of them are going to get millions. That's a bigger giveaway to the ultra-rich than most people make in a year. And to pay for it, they're going to steal from you, the American people. They are stealing from you. They are betraying the people who voted for them. This is a betrayal on a scale I don't think we've ever seen before. And I am going to fight to expose it and to stop it. I've said this over and over and over again. We need tax relief for workers, not the ultra-rich. We need to preserve Social Security and Medicare, not gut them to pay for corporate handouts. We should protect Medicaid and food benefits for working families, because we know these programs that people rely on and need when times get tough. So, Madam Speaker,
His time has expired.
Madam Speaker, you can shut me up.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman is not recognized. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Do I have? Thank you, Madam Speaker. Despite what Democrats may claim, the American people know the Biden-Harris administration caused enormous damage to our economy, weakened our national security, allowed millions of illegal immigrants and deadly fentanyl to flood across our southern border, and crippled American energy independence. That's exactly why voters rejected their failed leadership in the last election. Once again, this resolution does not cut a single specific program or benefit. The Democrats are speaking fear, not facts, and saying something over and over again that's false does not make it true. Democrats have told these lies before and were proven wrong. The Democrats want to continue 4 more years of Bidenomics. We want to put us on a path to prosperity. These are the same people claiming that there's no waste, fraud, or abuse in Washington. This resolution will begin a process that sets a fiscal framework to meet the agenda the American people demanded in November. Let's talk about some of their claims, that this is a handout to billionaires. It's their party that abandoned the middle class by spending like crazy. And not extending the 2017 Trump tax cuts would be the ultimate betrayal of the middle class. The average taxpayer in my district, in the 9th District of Indiana, would see a 26% tax hike if the tax cuts the Democrats oppose expire. A family of 4 making $67,000, the median income in my district, would see a $1,289 tax increase. More than 6 million people were lifted out of poverty under Republican tax reform, dropping the poverty rate to 10.5%, the lowest in U.S. history. They claim this budget slashes food assistance. This resolution makes no changes to current law, no cuts in benefits in this, 0. They claim costs will go up. We will reverse Biden's spending spree and bend the curve on mandatory spending that's driving our debt. Inflation skyrocketed 21% under the Biden administration. That's why 77 million Americans voted for President Trump, to fix the economy and rein in Washington's waste, fraud, abuse, and reckless spending. So let's go. Let's go with facts, not fear. This resolution doesn't say the word SNAP or Medicaid or school lunch once. We are cutting waste, fraud, and abuse for people who are here illegally. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act helped people get off SNAP, which is a good thing. A GAO report last year showed improper payments could be costing the federal government more than $500 billion annually. So I'm not here to fight with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'm here to fight on behalf of the American people. And that's exactly what we're going to continue to do. In the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, my friends want to scare the American people into thinking that this is a tax cut for billionaires, to detract from the fact that the 2017 tax cuts under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have been extremely successful. Let's look at what has made it a success. By every conceivable measure, American workers and the economy were better off. Americans earned bigger paychecks, unemployment for every group was at a historic low, and poverty dropped to its lowest level in history. The 2017 Trump tax cuts lowered tax rates for all Americans. In fact, the lowest earning individuals gained the most benefit. The bottom 20% of earners, those with incomes up to $26,000, saw their federal tax rate fall to the lowest point in 40 years. Earnings under $100,000 received an average cut of 16%, while the share of taxes paid by the top 1% increased. So this is not simply a tax cut for the rich. Finally, if these tax cuts expire, it will devastate our nation's families, workers, and small business owners. The average taxpayer would see a 22% tax hike, meaning on average they will pay $1,695 more in taxes. 40 million families will see their child tax credit cut in half. 26 million small businesses would be hit with a 43.4% top tax rate. This is over 20 points higher than what businesses pay in communist China. Because of House Republicans and President Trump, American workers enjoyed the fastest wage growth in a decade. This spread to Americans across the income distribution, with lower wage workers experiencing 50% higher wage growth than high-income workers. Higher wages led to a rapid growth in household income. In just 2 years after the enactment of the tax cuts, real median household income rose by over $5,000. In total, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act pro-growth policies helped contribute to 3% growth in 2018 and 2.6% growth in 2019, well above CBO's pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act projections of 2.2% and 1.7%, respectively. Meanwhile, we've seen what Bidenflation has cost American families. So again, this budget resolution does not cut a single specific program or benefit. The budget resolution sets a framework. It is a first step toward delivering on the America First agenda and getting our country back on track. We will secure our border. We will rebuild the American economy. We will unleash American energy and safeguard our financial future. 77 million Americans voted for this agenda, and it's our job to deliver on those promises. I look forward to moving these bills out of the House this week. I ask my colleagues to join me in voting yes on the previous question and yes on the rule. Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. On the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman from Massachusetts, for what
I
purpose?
ask for a recorded vote, the yeas and nays, Madam Speaker.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess for a period of less than 15 minutes.
If you want to put the American people first, we must reject this debacle and begin on a real bipartisan basis to pass a budget that fits for the American people.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Morrison.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today I rise on behalf of the nearly 80 million Americans across the country who get their health insurance through Medicaid. I rise as a physician who has cared for patients for more than 20 years, and I implore my colleagues to recognize that health insurance is not just a throwaway line item that you can scratch out in a budget. It is the difference between being able to receive the life-saving health care you need or not. Medicaid is the single largest source of health care coverage in the United States. Medicaid covers nearly half of all children, and it is the largest insurer of kids with disabilities. Medicaid is a vital source of prenatal and postpartum care for women, and it covers more than 40% of births in our country. The Republicans' dangerous proposal today is selling out the health and wellness of kids, families, seniors in nursing homes, and people with disabilities. And why? To make room for tax breaks for millionaires? This is wrong. We cannot stand for this. To my colleagues across the aisle, we need you to stand up for our children and families. Thank you.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I notice there's not a lot of people on the other side wanting to defend this budget. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, The Republican budget can be summed up in three simple words: defund, defraud, and deceive. First, the Republicans want to defund social safety net programs working families rely on, like Medicaid and school meals and food stamps. In my district alone, 425,000 individuals depend on Medicaid for their health care. That includes kids and people with disabilities. Second, Republicans want to defraud the American people by taking money from working families to hand out massive tax breaks to billionaires and corporations who pay little to no taxes. And finally, they are trying to deceive the American people by claiming that they're not cutting any programs. But we know at the end of the day that their budget will include cuts to Medicaid and programs that families depend on. Republicans need to step up, because this is not just a blue state or a Democratic issue. This will cut benefits, healthcare benefits, for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans across the country, including 171,000 in Arizona's 6th district.
The gentleman's time has expired.
So we need Republicans to step up.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Be shameful and pass this budget. With that,
The gentleman's time has
back.
expired.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I don't know if the gentleman wants to give us some of her time, because we get a lot of speakers over here. I guess not. Okay.
You're not up.
Hawaii. Hawaii. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Takuda.
Thank you. I rise today in strong opposition to the House Republican budget resolution, a blatant attempt to strip health care and food aid away from everyday Americans. With up to $2.5 trillion in Medicaid cuts and $230 billion slashed from SNAP, this budget plan would leave millions of families and seniors without essential support, and rural America would suffer the most. Nationwide, more than 12 million rural Americans rely on Medicaid, and SNAP participation is higher in rural areas than urban ones. In my home state of Hawaii, over 350,000 people rely on Medicaid, and nearly 1 in 5 depend on SNAP to eat. Rural Americans who live in 181 of our congressional districts, red and blue, already face some of the harshest health disparities, living 3 to 10 years less than their urban counterparts. These cuts will only deepen such inequities and leave them with no safety net. Let me be clear, these cuts will cost lives. These are not just numbers, they are real people. They are our neighbors, our grandparents, and our children. At a time when too many are struggling, Republicans are delivering tax breaks to billionaires on the backs of our working families. Americans in rural America deserve better. Our country deserves better. I urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me just say, by the way, Mr. Speaker, how's that mandate going for you guys now that voters are realizing that you betrayed them? Let's look at some of your newspapers from around the country. Georgia congressman confronted by angry crowd over support for Trump's agenda. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Quote, U.S. Rep. Rich McCormick was peppered with boos and catcalls throughout a town hall meeting in Roswell late Thursday as hundreds of critics jeered the Republican for backing President Donald Trump's agenda during his first month in office. There's another one. Quote, U.S. Rep. Glenn Grothman faces hostile crowd in Oshkosh town hall meeting. That's in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Quote, protesters urge Rep. Scott Perry to say no to Medicaid cuts. That's in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Quote, outside Congressman's office, protesters make noise over potential Medicaid cuts. That's from Representative Ryan McKenzie's district in Salisbury Township in Pennsylvania. I could spend an hour reading into the record, Mr. Speaker. Republicans are getting chewed out at all of their town halls. Something is happening in this country right now, and you can feel it, because people are waking up to the betrayal, and they are angry, and they have a right to be angry. So for my Republican colleagues, just remember that when you vote for this budget, you are on record. You have made it clear that you serve the billionaires and not your voters. And at this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Looking around this room, I ask my colleagues, shouldn't our government benefit those we represent back home? But what's being presented by my Republican colleagues today? A plan that would gut 152,483 of my neighbors at home who depend on Medicaid for health care. More than 66,000 kids under the age of 19. 10,000 seniors back home rely on Medicaid in Illinois 17 for their nursing home coverage. While you may see this as a numbers game on a budget, I see families, I see neighbors, I see loved ones, and let me let you in on a secret, because there aren't any Republicans in this room. There are more Republican constituents of mine that are calling my office saying, we may have voted for Donald Trump, but we didn't vote for him to do this. This is cruel and unusual punishment to single out everyday Americans, making them go without. Also, billionaire donors and big corporations get the tax breaks to make them more wealthy. Let's get back to doing the work for the American people who need us to do this work the most. I yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana, recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Can I inquire how much time we have remaining?
12 and 3/4 minutes remaining. And the gentleman from Indiana has 12 minutes.
I know the gentlelady doesn't seem to have any other speakers. I was wondering whether she might want to lend us some of her time. Okay, all right, thank you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, the Speaker Emerita, a powerful leader in the Democratic caucus, and for the country, Ms. Pelosi.
Proceedings will resume on questions
Thank you, Mr.
previously
Speaker. I thank the
postponed.
gentleman for
Votes will be
yielding
taken in
and
the
for
following
his
order.
exuberant...
Ordering the previous question on House Resolution 161 and adoption of the Resolution 161 if ordered. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on the House Resolution 161, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 4, House Resolution 161, Resolution providing for consideration of the joint resolution, House Joint Resolution 20, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rules submitted by the Department of Energy relating to Energy Conservation Program, Energy Conservation Standards for consumer gas-fired instantaneous water heaters, providing for consideration of the joint resolution, House Joint Resolution 35, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rules submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to waste emissions charge for petroleum and natural gas systems, procedures for facilitating compliance, including netting and exemptions, and providing for consideration of the concurrent resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 14, establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2025 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2026 through 2034.
The question is on ordering the previous question. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 216 and the nays are 210. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, ask for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 217 and the nays are 211. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Democratic Caucus, I offer a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 162. Resolved that the following
Mr.
name
Speaker, I ask
members...
unanimous consent that the resolution be considered as read.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. And without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Skip even. The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H-Con Res 14.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 161 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H-Con Res 14. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H-Con Res 14, which the clerk will report by title.
Concurrent resolution establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2025 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2026 through 2034.
Pursuant to the rule, the concurrent resolution is considered read for the first time. General debate shall not exceed 3 hours, with 2 hours confined to the congressional budget, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the committee on the budget or their respective designees, and 1 hour on the subject of economic goals and policies, equally divided and controlled by the Representative Mr. Schweikert of Arizona, Representative Beyer of Virginia, or their respective designees. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, each will control 1 hour of debate on the congressional budget. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, today we will unlock the policies for making America safe and prosperous again by advancing the FY25 budget resolution.
Gentlemen will suspend. Members of the chamber, would you kindly take your private conversations from the floor so that debate on the subject at hand in the House, the People's House, may continue. Gentleman from Texas.
As I was saying, Mr. Chairman, today we're going to unlock the policies to make America safe and prosperous again. This fiscal framework will guide the process for restoring the fiscal health of our nation by reining in reckless spending and reigniting economic growth. In addition, and importantly, it provides critical resources to our Commander-in-Chief to secure our borders, strengthen our military, and provide for the common defense. But for the next 2 hours, Mr. Chairman, my Democrat colleagues are going to reach way back to the only plays they know how to run, making false claims and fear-mongering. Why? Because they are still, even after the recent election, disconnected from the people's reality. Because they're more concerned with protecting unionized government bureaucrats and woke and wasteful government programs than they are about protecting taxpayers and their sacred treasure. Why? Because their commitment isn't to we the people in this fateful moment. It's to we the government and to derailing the mandate from the people for common sense policies and President Trump's America First agenda. I'm going to take some time to set the record straight, Mr. Chairman, so that every time the American people hear these false claims, to mislead them into thinking that the tax cuts somehow benefited the billionaires and corporations and that Republicans are cutting benefits for seniors and the poorest among us. I want the American people to know the truth. And here's the truth. The Trump tax cuts lowered tax rates for every American household at every income level while increasing the amount of taxes paid by the top 1%. According to the Washington Post, which, by the way, gave Democrats not one, not two, not three, 4 Pinocchios every time they made these misleading claims. They said 3 of every $4 in the Trump tax cuts didn't go to corporations, but they went to individuals. cutting taxes for the lowest income individuals by 10%, while cutting taxes for the top 1% of the income earners by less than 0.5%. In addition, we saw a record 25-year wage increase for median household incomes. Real wages at the bottom 10% rose 2 times faster than the top 10%. Real wealth at the bottom half of households rose 3 times faster than that of the top half of our country. A record 6 million people were lifted out of poverty. Black, Hispanic, and Asian American citizens experienced historic high incomes and all-time low unemployment. Here's the reality, Mr. Chairman. Our Democrat colleagues oppose the American people's tax cuts back in 2017, and they opposed their tax cuts today. And if they were successful in this endeavor, here's what would happen. We'd have a 22% tax hike on every American citizen, on average. They just suffered through a 21% tax hike from the inflation tax over the last 4 years and the worst cost of living crisis in modern history. Median income families would lose $1,700. 26 million small businesses would pay at the highest marginal rate and lose the 20% deduction, putting them on a comparable level to the corporate tax rates. Child tax credits, 40 million families would have the tax credit for their children cut in half. And 91% of the American people that get the standard deduction would have that cut in half. Those are the results of the Democrats standing in the way of what would be, if they were successful, the highest tax hike in American history. Here's the other false claim. To pay for these tax cuts, the Democrats are going to say that Republicans are cutting benefits for seniors and for, again, our poorest and most vulnerable among us. Here's the truth, Mr. Chairman. Republicans are fighting to right-size a woke, weaponized, and bloated bureaucracy, to root out the trillions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse, and to rein in the reckless spending of the Biden administration and our Democrat colleagues from over the last 4 years. Prior to 2019, before President Biden took office, and he and the Democrats jammed $2 trillion through in the so-called COVID relief, even though maybe 20% of that money actually went for the purposes of COVID relief. Our budget back then was $4.5 trillion. Today, it's $7 trillion. With the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, they gave away $700 billion in tax credits to green energy corporations. They expanded Obamacare subsidies to people making more than $500,000 and already had, many of whom already had employer-sponsored health care. And they expanded the IRS, $80 billion, 80,000 IRS agents, shaking down mostly middle-class people and small businesses. With the stroke of a pen, President Biden wasted $2 trillion unilaterally of taxpayer monies by opening up our welfare services, taxpayer-funded welfare services to people in this country illegally. He waived work requirements for means-tested welfare programs from SNAP to Medicaid and beyond, trapping people in poverty and dependence on the federal government. He mandated expensive and unreliable electric vehicles for all Americans and a whole lot more. In fact, we're spending $9,000 per illegal immigrant in this country for the millions of people who violated our sovereignty and came to this country in violation of our immigration laws. $9,000 of what taxpayers pay for people who are here illegally for taxpayer-funded social services. Mr. Chairman, that's more than we spend on the most vulnerable Americans for Medicaid. That's more than we spend collectively for our veterans for their military retirement. The President Biden, weakened government program integrity, allowing people who aren't eligible for Medicaid and other programs to receive benefits. Case in point, we used to review the Medicaid rolls twice a year to make sure people who were on the rolls were those who were most vulnerable and those who qualified according to the law. That was revoked by the Biden administration. And they only did it once a year. And if you changed it back, you'd eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse and save $160 billion of taxpayer monies. He implemented unconstitutional and regressive student loan bailouts, forcing working Americans to subsidize the upper middle class, law students, medical students. These are folks that deferred their education. These are hardworking people that didn't think they could afford college. We have an unprecedented opportunity, Mr. Chairman, and my fellow Republicans, and we have a sacred obligation at this moment to meet this moment with the urgency it demands. Now more than ever is the time for Republicans in Congress to demonstrate the courage of their convictions and take the bold action in this historic moment. Save this country. Save our children's future. Save us from wrecking the greatest economy in the world, for jeopardizing our national security and our leadership in the world. The world is counting on a safe, strong, and free America. And I believe that this bill encapsulates the policies that are going to restore America's greatness. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield. And I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle.
Mr. Chair, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we should be quite clear about what this is really about. This budget represents a Republican betrayal of the middle class, and I'm proud to rise and oppose it. Here's what's at stake. My friends on the other side of the aisle want to deliver $4.5 trillion of tax cuts, almost all of which go to the richest 1% of Americans. Now, how do they pay for it? How do they pay for that $4.5 trillion of tax cuts? First, at least $880 billion from Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. Those cuts from Medicaid, by the way, represent the largest cuts to Medicaid in American history. 72 million Americans get their health care from Medicaid. We're mostly talking about seniors, children, and those with disabilities. Another 20 million Americans get their health care from the ACA. So combined, we are talking about 92 million Americans whose health care is at risk. And why? All to deliver tax cuts to billionaires. But now we have a math problem, because even with those, the largest cuts to Medicaid in history, you don't get anywhere close to $4.5 trillion. So how do they finance the rest of it? Well, we have more cuts. Hundreds of billions more in cuts to education programs like school lunches, Head Start, student loan repayment. We also have $230 billion of cuts to nutrition assistance at a time when grocery prices are at record highs. So all told, that gets you to at least $1.5 trillion. But remember, the size of the tax cuts are $4.5 trillion, and they want to add some more spending on top of that. So what do they do to make up the difference? Increase the national debt by $4 trillion. A massive increase to our national debt from the same crowd that for the last 4 years has done nothing but shed crocodile tears about the size of our national debt. You can always tell when there's a Democrat in the White House, because that's when the other side cares about the size of the national debt. But when there's a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, the top priority is always tax cuts for the top 1%. A budget isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a reflection of our values. It's a reflection of what kind of country we are and want to be. There was a lot of campaigning going on throughout this country, and especially in my state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, this past November. After all, we are the biggest battleground state in the nation. A lot of promises were made on both sides. A lot of it was about reducing costs for ordinary Americans. Not once, ever in that campaign, did I ever hear the other side say, we're going to cut Medicaid to the tune of $880 billion, the biggest cuts to Medicaid in American history. In fact, we have a president who said, and I quote, "I will love and cherish Medicaid." Then a few hours later, he endorsed the House Republican plan that slashes Medicaid to the tune of $880 billion. When this president promises to love and cherish something, watch your wallets. Folks, I think the American people are going to figure out what this is about. It's right there in black and white. The $880 billion I talked about, it's right there in their 58-page resolution. The $4 trillion increase in debt, right there in black and white in their resolution. No amount of spinning will get you away from that simple reality. This is cutting health care and all sorts of programs for the American people in order to deliver tax cuts for billionaires who don't need it. I urge every member in this House to oppose this reckless and unfair plan, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, what you won't hear from my Democrat colleagues is any mention of the $500 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicaid program that jeopardizes that program for the most vulnerable Americans and does a disservice to every taxpayer in this great country of ours. By the way, betrayal of the middle class. When I hear that, what comes to mind is the unbridled spending and the failed economic policies that gave us the worst cost of living crisis in modern history. And a whole lot of people suffered under that 21% inflation tax, and a whole lot more people would suffer under a 22% tax increase if they were successful in killing the American people's tax cuts. Now I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and the vice chair of the Budget Committee and a key architect, I would say, of this budget blueprint, Mr. Lloyd Smucker from the Keystone State.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to thank the chair for yielding. Mr. Speaker, we've heard how this budget resolution will deliver tax relief to working and middle-class families. It'll put a stop to crime and drugs flooding over our southern border, and it'll jumpstart the American economy. And this is exactly what the American people are looking for today. Unfortunately, we've also heard a lot of falsehoods from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and so I'd like to set the record straight. The House Republican budget resolution will stop a 22% tax hike for the average taxpayer. It will put $1,700 back into the pockets of a median family of 4 and will prevent the child tax credit from being cut in half for 40 million families. This bill doesn't take from the working class, it puts money in their pockets. And while my colleagues on the other side try to drown out these facts with tired talking points and fear-mongering, let's ask the American people directly. How does a 22% tax hike help you pay your bills? Families, how does taking $1,700 out of your pocket and cutting your child tax credit help you raise your kids? Can I get 30 seconds?
Give the gentleman 30 more seconds, please, Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman.
recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
It doesn't. And Republicans are working to stop those tax hikes by passing this budget resolution. President Trump was elected by the working class, and this budget will deliver on the promises he made to them. I'm very proud to support this budget resolution and urge my colleagues to vote yes. Thank you, and I yield back.
I reserve, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I would remind my fellow Pennsylvanian that this bill would put 3.1 million people in Pennsylvania at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this Republican budget resolution. Make no mistake about it. This budget will lead to millions of Americans losing their health care coverage, all so Republicans can give giant tax breaks to billionaires and big corporations. The only group that wants these tax breaks is Wall Street, not the average American. Mr. Speaker, if Republicans pass this resolution today, we'll be forced to cut a minimum of nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid, our nation's largest health care program. And for those who are saying that somehow the Medicaid program has a lot of waste, let me remind us that Medicaid is the leanest federal health care program. Every independent study says that Medicaid is financially sound, the most financially sound federal health care program. The consequences of these cuts will be devastating. Medicaid provides health care to 1 in 3 Americans, nearly half of the children in the United States, and it's the largest source of funding for nursing home for seniors and people living with disabilities. This is a life-saving program for 80 million Americans. They count on it every day. And yet today, House Republicans are unnecessarily rushing forward with a budget resolution that will impose the largest health care cuts in our nation's history. Millions of people will lose their health care. But that's just the beginning. Health care prices will sharply rise. Hospitals, particularly those in underserved and rural communities, will be forced to close. So too will nursing homes. Seniors will lose the care that they rely on, and doctors and nurses will be laid off. Emergency rooms will once again be overflowing as people are forced to delay care until absolutely necessary. And states will be bankrupted and forced to make painful cuts to important health care services. This is the reality, not what the Republicans are telling you. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't have to be this way. If just a few of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle take a stand today, we can stop this from happening. So I implore my Republican colleagues to think about the harm, the devastating harm that would be done to their communities if this budget resolution is adopted. Stand up. I urge my colleagues to think twice and vote no, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the Tar Heel State, former Speaker of the House of North Carolina and Budget Committee member, Mr. Tim Moore.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last November, the American people said enough is enough. They're tired of government waste, they're tired of rising prices, and they're tired of policies of the last administration. This budget is a critical step forward towards reining in out-of-control federal spending. To be clear, this resolution has no provisions that make cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. For those folks watching at home, read the bill. It's not in there. When Democrats vote against this today, they are voting to raise the average family of four's taxes by nearly $1,700. They're voting to raise taxes on small business, they're voting for open borders, and they're voting for higher energy costs. I'm proud to have worked with my fellow House Budget Committee members on this bill, as well as the chairman, who's done an amazing job on this, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this important measure. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 2.8 million people in North Carolina at risk of losing Medicaid. Mr. Chair, with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the looting is underway. Our colleagues are running the same failed playbook of trickle-down handouts. My friend, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, said the family of four, they're going to get $1,700. Look at the tax distribution tables and what billionaires are going to get in this. That's the real issue that's in front of us on this occasion. Let me go to another point that I think is fascinating. DOJ is rummaging through your private records even as we speak. How about the following? Imagine what the Republican reaction would have been if Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, or Joe Biden said, we're going to borrow $4 trillion more for these tax cuts for the wealthiest amongst us. Don't kid yourself. Medicaid, 71 million Americans, Medicare, Social Security, the American people depend upon these issues. I'm stunned that Republicans would borrow $4 trillion to justify tax cuts for the wealthiest amongst us. And by the way, people who aren't even asking for those tax cuts. Their cuts will affect every part of American life, including those who need basic sustenance every day. $4 trillion, and look at the alignment. $1.2 trillion here for cuts, but $1.2 trillion for tax cuts. Oh, let me figure that one out. They are going to cut Medicaid to justify what it is that they want to do. There is no reason why billionaires should be getting a massive tax cut. Totally unnecessary, and in the end, that's what this legislation is about, despite their protestations. $1,700 for a family of four. Tens of millions of dollars for billionaires. That's where these tax cuts are going. I want you also to understand this. The people are watching. We're going to defend Medicare, we're going to defend Medicaid, and we're going to defend all of these entities that have made a difference in American life for average people every single day. Let me close on this note. My father had a great saying. He used to say, Jesse James at least had the respect to wear a mask. They should be wearing masks for what they're doing today. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to my friend, the gentleman from Kansas, another Budget Committee member, who had a hand in developing this fiscal framework, Mr. Ron Estes.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support for starting the process to pass one big, beautiful bill for America. For 4 years, Americans suffered from an open border, crippling inflation, massive federal spending, and burdensome regulation. On top of that, we're on the verge of increased taxes for families, workers, and small businesses if we fail to act. Our mandate is to restore and secure our nation, both physically and financially. It's critical that we pass a bill that enables us to address all of these priorities, including an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In my home state, Kansans will see an average of $2,200 increase in their taxes if we don't act now and we allow the tax cuts to expire. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made false claims about this budget resolution that will cut Social Security. As chairman of the Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee, I want to emphasize with the strongest terms possible that this budget resolution does not do a single thing to cut Social Security. In fact, Social Security cannot be amended in the budget resolution in the budget reconciliation process. The Byrd Rule prevents consideration of reconciliation in the Senate that changes the Social Security program. I support today's budget resolution as a next step in advancing America's first policies, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chair, the gentleman from Kansas is right. It is a big, beautiful bill for billionaires. I would also remind the gentleman that this bill would put 410,000 people in his state of Kansas at risk of losing Medicaid. I yield 2 minutes now to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, the ranking member of the Educational Workforce Committee, also a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Scott.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution. It's frankly hard to take my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seriously when they come up here and give speech after speech complaining about the deficit and then support this resolution that increases the deficit. Let's start with some facts. Every single Democratic president since Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better deficit situation than they inherited. And every Republican president since Nixon has left a worse deficit situation than the one they inherited, all without exception. So here we are again. Republican president following a Democratic president, and Republicans are set to increase the deficit and national debt just like clockwork. Democrats have been finding solutions and cleaning up Republican messes for 6 decades, and thanks to Republican tax cuts and for the corporations in the top 1%, they added over $7 trillion to the national debt during Trump's first term, and here we go again. Help billionaires run up the debt and make everybody else pay. As ranking member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, I'm particularly outraged that Republicans want to fund these tax cuts for corporations and billionaires by making cuts to educational and nutritional programs. This could end up cutting things like Meals on Wheels, children's feeding programs. It could jeopardize Head Start, make it harder for students to receive K-12 education and higher education, and it will certainly rip away health care from millions of Americans. There is nothing economically responsible for this budget because it increases the deficit. It helps billionaires, but working families and middle class will pay the price. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania continues to reserve. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman, my good friend from Oklahoma, and our conference policy chair, Mr. Kevin Hern.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the chairman for yielding. You know, one of America's most famous sons, Will Rogers, once said, quote, "It costs 10 times more to govern us than it used to, and we're not governed 1/10 as good." And that was in 1932. I can only imagine what he would say today. That's why this vote is so important. It moves us closer to delivering on the mandate the American people overwhelmingly demanded in November. We are on an unsustainable path, and every member of this body knows it. Every member. This budget resolution commits us to investing in strong border security and strengthening our national defense. It directs committees to find ways to make the President's tax agenda permanent. It paves the way to unleash American energy production. The budget resolution calls for historic spending cuts as Congress works with the President to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, something that every single one of us, regardless of party, should applaud, all in one big, beautiful bill. Failure to unite on this vote very well may result in breaking up the President's agenda. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. Together we can build a stronger, more prosperous America before it's too late. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chair, I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 990,000 people in Oklahoma at risk of losing Medicaid. I'm now happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, the ranking member of the Agricultural Committee, Ms. Craig.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this resolution that prioritizes tax cuts for billionaires over the well-being of hardworking American families and the livelihoods of our nation's farmers. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is our nation's most effective anti-poverty tool and a key part of the Farm Bill, which Republicans want to cut by $230 billion. This would cause millions of hardworking Americans to suffer, including some of the most vulnerable in our communities, children, seniors, and the disabled. Decimating SNAP in this way would break up the coalition that is critical to passing a bipartisan farm bill and hurts the entire food supply chain when times are tough in farm country and in many communities, especially rural communities across this country. Right now, as people across our nation are struggling with the high cost of groceries, SNAP helps American families keep food on the table. And let's be clear about what we're talking about. $6 a day for people in need. $6 to those who qualify. SNAP reduces childhood poverty, improves health outcomes, and generates hundreds of thousands of jobs throughout the food supply chain. Because when you spend $1 on food, you aren't just paying for the food in your cart. You're helping to pay for the salary of the grocery store clerk who stocked the shelves, the trucker who delivered the food to the store, the manufacturer who produced the packaging, and the farmer who grew it. The future of a bipartisan farm bill, which our farmers desperately need, is in Republican hands today. If you cut SNAP to pay for tax cuts for your wealthy donors, it's on you. I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, the first state, my good friend and member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Ben Klein.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, back in November, the American people issued a resounding rejection of the profligate policies of the Biden-Harris administration that existed over the past 4 years by electing President Donald Trump. In the first month of the new administration, President Trump has answered this election mandate, signing executive orders aimed at securing our nation's borders, unleashing domestic energy production, and rooting out the waste, fraud, and abuse that was left over as the final remnants of Biden's failed legacy. However, the president cannot achieve all of these policy objectives alone. He needs Congress. It will take those of us in the House and Senate concerned about addressing our fiscally irresponsible the last 4 years, working together in unified fashion to pass a reconciliation package that is set in motion by today's budget resolution to give this administration the tools they need to succeed in fulfilling their election mandate. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this budget as we work to deliver real savings for the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 1.8 million people in the Commonwealth of Virginia at risk of losing Medicaid. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, distinguished colleague on the Budget Committee, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this is the Republican reconciliation because it makes a wreck of our nation's finances and it makes the wreck of the lives of so many of our fellow Americans. These Republicans are so troubled, so very troubled about our nation's debt that they want to add trillions more to it. In fact, according to the bipartisan Citizens for a Responsible Federal Budget, they want to make it bigger by about $4 trillion, deeper in debt. Elon Musk Doge, it is Dodge also, is a sideshow for a multi-ring circus of deception and lies designed to create the illusion that billions are being saved from waste, fraud, and abuse when Doge itself is the abuse. Even with these fake savings, the insatiable demand of these Republicans for additional billionaire tax breaks requires denying opportunities to middle-class families, denying access to a family physician, first by slashing hundreds of millions from Medicaid, for which Trump professes to love and cherish. Medicaid, which pays for half the babies born at Seton Hospital in Austin, half the children that go to the children's hospital there. Millions of Americans will lose health protection, and millions more will lose educational opportunity. For those who are facing a dread disease like cancer, Republicans are cutting innovative medical research in the hope for a cure. With the looming threat of a bird flu pandemic, 40% cut in the staff of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. All of this represents more Republican broken promises. Remember when Trump last month was going to bring down grocery prices drastically? Well, the only thing drastic is the pain of this Republican budget. Now Trump tells us we'll have a golden age in America. With this budget imposing so many burdens on our finances, the sick, the hungry, and students, we see who gets the gold. Those billionaires that were on the front seat of his inauguration as working families are betrayed. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Chairman, I wonder when my Democrat colleagues will direct their indignation and outrage to the fact that that Doge and our friend Elon Musk has exposed a tremendous, outrageous, and utterly offensive waste like transgender operas in Colombia, DEI musicals in Ireland, transgender comic books, $20 million on Sesame Street, which is I would only have to assume my Democrat colleagues think that's the way to find peace in the Middle East. It's insane and it's offensive to the taxpayers, but you'll never hear a single word about that in this debate today. And with that, I yield 1 minute to my friend, General Jack Bergman from the great state of Michigan.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's crucial that we're clear about the focus of today's debate. Our aim is not to remove vulnerable Americans from the government assistance programs they and their families depend on. On the contrary, we are focused on strengthening the integrity of these programs to ensure the taxpayers' dollars are directed to those who genuinely need them. In the past decade, Medicaid has accounted for over $550 billion, with a B, dollars in improper payments, making it one of the government's largest sources of payment errors. It would be irresponsible and a betrayal of our fiduciary duty to American taxpayers not to make a focused effort to recover these misused funds and redirect them to those who need them most. That said, it's essential that these efforts are made with a careful approach that avoids unintended consequences for vulnerable Americans and providers. As my colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee begin their critical efforts, I would urge them to keep this in the top of mind, and I urge all my colleagues to support this good resolution. Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 2.4 million people in Michigan at risk of losing Medicaid. And Mr. Chair, let's be clear, that's what this debate is about. Because the other side is great at trying to distract you, holding up the shiny object of a few outlandish stories about tens of thousands of dollars to distract you from the trillions of dollars that are at stake. 1 in 3 Americans, 1 in 3, get their health care from Medicaid. That is at risk because of this proposal, and don't forget it. Don't allow yourself to get distracted. With that, I am happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, my colleague and friend on the Budget Committee, Mr. Peters.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our national debt is more than $36 trillion. We borrow nearly $2 trillion every year just to pay our expenses. And we spend more on interest payments now than we do on Medicaid, schools, child care, and the national defense. Republicans have raised the alarm about this deficit, but this budget actually makes the debt and deficit much, much worse. They say we have a spending problem. Okay, then cut annual spending to a level that's covered by our revenues and stop the deficits. But that's not what they're doing here. Oh, they will make big cuts to health care, air traffic controllers, cybersecurity, the people who fight wildfires, but they will not use those savings to cut deficits. They will use those savings to pay for tax cuts for people who don't need them. America doesn't have a spending problem. We have a borrowing problem. And this budget would lead to more borrowing we can't afford. It would limit our ability to borrow money when we do need it, when there's a future urgent need. But today the economy has low unemployment and high interest rates, the exact wrong time to blow up the debt. This bill will add between $4 and $11 trillion to the debt, which will increase interest rates, raise prices, and keep inflation high, and our kids are going to pick up the bill. Don't vote for this self-inflicted harm. I work with many of my Republican colleagues as co-chair of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum on controlling the debt and deficit, and I know some are sitting here quietly agreeing with me. I know personally also how hard it is to buck your party, because when Democrats held the House, the Senate, and the White House, I voted no on our reconciliation budget to get a better product. Let me tell you, it was very unpopular. But I held my ground, and people at home knew I was standing up for them. We got a better product, and they sent me back. We work with presidents. We don't report to them. We report to our constituents. As independently elected members of Congress who are elected on the exact same day as Donald Trump, do your job. You know better. Vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the great state of Texas, my friend Mr. Brandon Gill, also a member of the Budget Committee.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Arrington, for your leadership throughout this process. Mr. Speaker, President Trump delivered historic results. He is securing our border, restoring common sense, lowering costs, and reestablishing America's strength in the world, and he is stopping our tax dollars from funding woke, perverted projects that the other side of the aisle seeks to push. But today, 60% of American taxpayers are facing rising taxes and uncertainty. To address these challenges, this resolution will provide for the extension of the Trump tax cuts, funds the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history, and cuts at least $1.5 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse from our federal budget. This is something that should receive bipartisan support. Our commitment to fiscal discipline is clear. Conservatives on the Budget Committee added a provision that incentivizes a total of $2 trillion in reductions. The American people are begging for Washington to unlock the Trump agenda, which this bill does. They gave us a mandate to save this country. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 4.2 million people in Texas at risk of losing Medicaid. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Ohio, distinguished member and friend from the Budget Committee, Ms. Capter.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for the opportunity to speak and say, thank him for his great work, and say that budgets are about choices for the American people. If we look at what is happening with this current budget, it's a bonanza for billionaires. We live at a moment in our country when 1% of our population, the very top, hold as much wealth as the bottom half of our country. 1% of the top. Billionaires, millionaires hold more wealth than the bottom half of our people. It's an astounding moment in which we are living. The very top are not paying their fair share, and everybody in America knows it, including them. How many more mansions do we need to see that take up acres and acres? How many yachts do these people actually need? Some of the old movies about Goldfinger and all come to mind. Some people seem to like gold a whole lot in this country. If the tax cuts that are proposed in this bill offer a few $100s to people who live in the bottom half of our country, which is most of the people that I represent, the bottom half of incomes, the people at the top are going to get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars back. I say to myself, do they have any conscience about what is happening in their country? And that to take away the health care, Medicare, Medicaid, the cuts that you're proposing, you will cause death in this country. To me, what is happening here is shameless. Here's a chart. If we look back at who caused the debt in our country, wow, it's pretty obvious. If we go back to the Reagan presidency, all you're doing is just repeating what happened. They added $2 trillion. Then the Bush 2 tax cuts added $8 trillion. The Trump tax cuts are already over $2.5 trillion.
Yield the lady an additional 15 seconds.
Gentlelady is given an additional 15 seconds.
I thank you. The Afghan and Iraq wars declared by Republican presidents added $8 trillion. So if you look at this, 2/3 of what we owe were caused by your side of the aisle. I represent a lot of Republicans, and I'll tell you what, they're honest people, and they'll pay their taxes, but they don't like this excess. It's hurting America. The Republican budget is just a bonanza for billionaires. Shame on you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves his time. I would remind my colleagues in the House to direct their comments to the chair, please. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the great state of Georgia, my friend and another Budget Committee member, Mr. Andrew Clyde.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the House Budget Committee's FY25 budget resolution, which advances President Trump's America First agenda by unlocking the budget reconciliation process to achieve the President's priorities and restore fiscal sanity in Washington. This budget resolution paves the way to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed into law by President Trump in 2017, which fueled historic economic growth and raised real wages. This resolution also provides instructions to reverse Biden's assault on domestic energy, rein in reckless spending, and deliver critical resources to the Trump administration so we can secure our border and strengthen our national security. Finally, I want to address the fear-mongering among our Democrat colleagues. This budget resolution does not cut benefits for any legitimate recipient of Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. I challenge anyone to find a single provision in this 45-page resolution that cuts benefits, because they can't. This resolution simply sets a budget framework so we can deal with the incredible fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid, to stabilize and preserve it for those who really need it. GAO alone estimates that the fraud in Medicaid...
From Georgia is given another 15 seconds.
Thank you. GAO alone estimates that the fraud in Medicaid is at least $50 billion a year. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to submit this report from the GAO into the record, which states $50 billion a year of improper payments, and I yield.
Gentleman's request is covered by general leave. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Well, since the gentleman asked the question, I'm happy to answer it. Right there in the bill, $880 billion directed to the Energy and Commerce Committee as a floor to find savings. Another word for cuts. There is only one place that can come from. Literally, if they cut 100% else of everything ENC has purview over, it would still leave them hundreds of billions of dollars short. It has to come from Medicaid. It has to come from the ACA premiums, because much like when Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks, he replied, because that's where the money is. Likewise, in terms of the ENC cuts, the $880 billion, it has to come from Medicaid, because that's the only place you can find $880 billion. Don't be fooled by their rhetorical tricks. And with that, I yield 2 minutes To the gentlewoman from New Jersey, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Standing in opposition. During their campaigns, Donald Trump and my Republican colleagues promised to get to work to lowering prices for the American people. This budget is a betrayal of that promise. It's a betrayal of millions of our children, our parents, and our seniors. It's a betrayal of the 1/3 of New Jersey children who rely on Medicaid. It's a betrayal of the 1/3 of new mothers who count on Medicaid for their prenatal care. It's a betrayal of 6 in 10 New Jersey seniors living in nursing homes. It's a ripoff of New Jersey taxpayers as Republicans have prioritized tax cuts for their billionaire donors over the lives of everyday citizens who will suffer under this new budget. My neighbor, Tom Kane, has over 70,000 Medicaid recipients, including over 27,000 children. Does Congressman Van Drew from New Jersey know a vote for this budget means abandoning 177,000 of his residents for the billionaire class? Does Congressman Chris Smith know that there are 178 Medicaid recipients in his district, including nearly 100,000 children, who will be cut and will lose their coverage simply to enrich Trump's billionaire friends? A few weeks ago, I offered an amendment in the Budget Committee to eliminate these disastrous cuts. Not a single Republican gave me a vote on this issue. Last night, I offered the same amendment to the Rules Committee, and the same outcome, not one Republican vote. I only hope that there are at least a few of my Republican colleagues today who have the courage and the humanitarian to stand up for their most vulnerable constituents and to vote no. I urge a no vote here, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, our Agriculture Committee Chair, and my friend G.T. Thompson.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this budget resolution begins the process of delivering on President Trump's agenda, and that agenda is clear. It's securing the border, it's unleashing economic growth, it's providing efficiency and accountability in government, it's reining in reckless spending that spurred record inflation. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to talk about the harmful provisions within this resolution. In reality, this is the beginning of the process. It's the beginning of a course correction that is desperately needed following 4 years of policy that placed America in a position of excess and decline. Speaking of excess, since President Trump's first term, increased enrollment and exploitation of the 2018 Farm Bill by the Biden administration ballooned the annual spending on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program by 66% of the total cost of $256 billion, leaving workers on the sidelines while small businesses paying record wages struggle to find help. This egregious executive overreach not only violated the Congressional Review Act, but likely reduced the fraction of people participating in the workforce and contributed to inflation. Mr. Speaker, we must meet the vital supplemental food needs of Americans that Congress committed to fulfill through SNAP, and we will. We cannot allow excess or lack of accountability within the bureaucracy, though, to compromise fulfilling that obligation. Thoughtful policies that recognize the value of work, hold states accountable, promote program integrity, and in the long run protect the safety net for those Americans who truly need it should be our priority. At the same time, we must use this process to advance the needs of the farm economy. We cannot leave our most ardent supporters in rural America without new resources and empty-handed for a third year. House Republicans have a mandate to restore America's faith in government, and we will protect hardworking taxpayers, bringing the largest tax increase in American history, and will provide for the neediest among us while simultaneously delivering a foundation for economic growth and prosperity. Mr. Speaker, let us ensure America is once again the land of opportunity and thriving communities, and passage of this resolution is one step in that process. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Let me remind the managers on both sides of the time remaining in this portion of the debate. The majority side has 39 3/4 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Pennsylvania still manages 37 1/2 minutes remaining in this portion of the debate. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would remind my friend and fellow Pennsylvanian who just spoke, this bill would put 3.1 million people in our beloved Commonwealth of Pennsylvania at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Plaskett.
Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this budget. We know that a budget is a statement of values. In simple terms, you put your money where your mouth is. And the money my Republican colleagues are getting right now is going to the class that they are beholden to, the uber wealthy. The bulk of those called savings come from slashing Medicaid funding, which ensures that 70 million Americans, and funds from the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, where another 10 million American children are helped. Those savings that they're getting are being created so that they can then give that money, give those savings to the ultra-rich. 20% of the population of the Virgin Islands are at risk of losing their health care under this budget. Veterans, children, families that are working, that are barely making it, rely on this. My fellow Americans, right here, right now, Republicans are trying to steal health care from 80 million people, and they're heading to the bank as millions of Americans are left helpless. What is happening? What's going on? Republicans are intentionally targeting grandmothers, targeting children, targeting veterans that live in your neighborhood. My fellow Americans, they're going to throw some peanuts, a couple of $100 at each one of us, and tell us that you're getting some taxes back. But that's the amount of money that the very wealthy are getting. Average $314,000 are going to them at the expense of American people. Fraud, waste, and abuse. They're going to tell you they're using that money to get rid of illegals. They're going to tell you